Okay, tonight we are going to be finishing up Leviticus, chapters 25 through 27. So three chapters, but there's a good amount of stuff that we're going to go over here. And as we are wrapping up the book of Leviticus, this has been a lot of laws, a lot of things about purity, a lot of sacrificial laws, and it can be a little overwhelming. And even just as reflecting on this book, um, this is the most time that I have devoted to studying and teaching through this book. It's one of those books that you refer to from time to time, but don't necessarily go through the whole scope of the book. And so this has been really eye-opening to me. And I've read Leviticus numbers of times, but I've never had to like do research and study it deeply. And it's just fascinating to me how much of this book, how much we read in this book, and the people are still at Sinai. They have not moved. And so next week we'll start in Numbers, and Numbers they will start to get ready to move out of Sinai. But even then, they're not going to get very far before they get turned around because of their disobedience. So not a lot of action in this book, and Numbers we'll start picking up with some more um, movement and stories along with some laws and counting and census and that kind of stuff. But today we're going to be just looking at these three chapters, and chapter 25 looks at laws about redemption, looking at the Sabbath year, and um, so setting people free from debt, from slavery, restoring land back to people with the year of Jubilee. So we'll look at that. And then chapter 26 is looking at blessings for covenant obedience and curses for covenant disobedience. And so we will see that again in Deuteronomy. And then in Joshua, we'll see that when the people read the law and read the blessings and the curses are much more intense than the blessings. But when we read stuff like that, we should keep in mind that the Lord desires to bless, not to curse. And so that's 26. And then we'll come back to laws about redemption in verse 27. And so we've got a little bit of a chiasmic structure here. And so these three chapters are preparing us for getting to the land that God had promised the people of Israel. And so they are still in the wilderness and eager to get to the land. And so these three laws have a lot to do with what they will do when they are there. So let's just jump into 25, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the seventh year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself and your male and female servants and hired workers and temporary residents who live among you, as well as for your livestock and your wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten." And so part of God's desire is to build rhythms of rest. And so we see that in the weekly Sabbath rhythm. But then God also wants the people to observe that the land itself deserves a rest, and to also keep in mind that the land is not ultimately theirs. The land belongs to the Lord. And so he's giving these laws about Sabbath rest for the land, because it's his land and they are tenants on the land. And so they are supposed to work the 6 years and rest on that seventh year. And they can't do any kind of trimming or sowing or anything. They need to let the land just do what the land's going to do, and they can do some kinds of non-agricultural work, um, and pick and eat whatever the land grew naturally, but any kind of tending the land is prohibited. So no sowing, pruning, or harvesting. but they could glean off the land. Um, and the promise here is that the Lord will provide for them in verses 6 and 7. That if they take it seriously, the Lord will meet them and make sure that they have enough. And when we get to later on in the land and in the history of the people of Israel, we see in 2 Chronicles 36 that they didn't really ever do this regularly. And so it was part of the reason why the people went into exile was because they were not observing the Sabbath rest for the land or the year of Jubilee. And so they were, the Lord even says that he will send that they will be sent out of the land so that the land can get its rests. So 70 years in exile, and so making up for 7 generations of not getting the Sabbath rest. We see that in Jeremiah and 2 Chronicles. So there's that 7th year rest, but then another rest is the year of Jubilee, and that picks up in verse 8. Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout the land, consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the untended vines, for it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. If you sell land to any of your own people or buy land from them, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee, and they are to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. When the years are many, you shall increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what is really being sold to you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. And so this 50th year is this year of Jubilee. So they get to the 49th year, which is a Sabbath year. And then another year on top of that, consecutively, is a year of Jubilee, which is another Sabbath for the land. And so they're not harvesting, pruning, tending the fields. They can only eat what is directly produced from the field. And so so they're not doing any more work on the land. But then also, all the land that has been sold is returned back to the original owners of the land. Because again, this is God's land, and he has given it to the people of Israel as an inheritance from him. And so they are tenants of the land. He is the one who ultimately dictates the terms of the land. And that's one of the reasons why like passages like this end with, but fear your God, I am the Lord your God, reminding the people who and what, who gave them the land and what his desire for the land is. And also being very clear, like we start this on the Day of Atonement, which is the new year, closer to the harvest time. And so they've already probably gotten into that rhythm of the high holy days and the festivals and all that stuff. And so that day they sound the trumpet and they consecrate themselves. They prepare for the Day of Atonement, and then they have a year of restoration, of Jubilee, of freedom. And so all of the debts that people had are forgiven. The land is returned. And that's usually why people would sell their land in the first place, was to pay off debts. And so looking how close the Jubilee year is, the Lord even gives them commands about how much they can actually sell their land for, or lease their land is really what it is, lease their land for, because it's all based on the number of crops that can be produced up to the time of the Jubilee. And so here, this is one more time where the Lord is calling the people to trust him. And so this is a demonstration of trust, just like the sixth day, trusting that the Lord would provide enough manna for the seventh day as well, but only on that time. It's an act of compassion because we see the desire for the Lord to bring people back to their homelands, to help them to get back into, um, you know, back into right standing in the society, freedom from all the debts, um, and for people like slaves, servants, hired hands, those people also are taking this year off to be restored and returned back to family. And then it's also a witness to others because they are showing that they are living differently than the nations around them, differently than what is expected. And so, if there are foreigners who are living among the people of Israel and they see everybody reverting back to their ancestral lands and all that, that it's a reminder to the people visiting that God is calling the people of Israel to live separately and distinctly. Let's jump to verse 18. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, what will we eat in the seventh year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send you such a blessing in the sixth year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the eighth year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest for the ninth year comes in. And so the Lord's promise to provide is more than just enough for the next few weeks, but for this the next 2 years, essentially, into the eighth year, so that when the time they harvest in that eighth year, they have food for the ninth year. Verse 23, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as my possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient funds to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property, but if they do not acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property. And so this is there's a term in, and we will get to in and see and use in the book of Ruth, the kinsman redeemer. And this is where that kinsman redeemer principle comes from. So if you remember, Ruth's mother-in-law, her husband dies, and Ruth's husband and her brother-in-law, they die, and so their land is kind of up for grabs because there was a great famine and they're poor, and so Ruth is coming in back in with Naomi, the mother-in-law, into the land to as poor people, essentially as foreigners coming in, and their family has land, but they would need a kinsman redeemer to come and secure the land for them for the future. And so the first kinsman redeemer does not do it. So the next in line would be Boaz, who could come and buy the land and restore Naomi's family line back into the land. And so that's where that comes from. And so as they are looking at this, like, somebody in your family is the first line of defense against selling your land. If you go to your uncle and say, listen, I don't have enough money, I didn't produce enough crops last year on my land, can you redeem my land so that, like, it stays in the family? If that doesn't happen, then you can sell it based on the years coming up to the Jubilee, on the possibility for what could be raised. And if that person is able then to buy it back, they refund what the sale price was up to that point. And so yeah, so it's not about trying to take advantage of others or get a good deal on land when people are desperate. They still are. The goal is always restoration for land. But there is a little exception in cities. Verse 29, anyone who sells a house in a walled city retains the right of redemption a full year after its sale. During that time, the seller may redeem it. If it is not redeemed before a full year has passed, the house in the wild city shall be permanently belong permanently to the buyer and the buyer's descendants. It is not to be returned in the Jubilee. But houses and villages without walls around them are to be considered as belonging to the open country. They can be redeemed, and they are to be returned in the Jubilee. So anyone in a city, you have 1 year to redeem that land and the house in the city. But outside in the villages, those are always up for the Jubilee. The Levites always have the right to redeem their houses in Levitical towns, which they possess. So the property of the Levites is redeemable. That is a house sold in any town they hold and is to be returned in the Jubilee, because the houses in the towns of the Levites are their property among the Israelites, but the pasture land belonging to their towns must not be sold. It is their permanent possession. And so Levites, even in a town or city, they have the opportunity to redeem houses, partly because the Levites need to be able to stay in the community where the Lord has distributed them, because they aren't in one region of the land. They're all throughout all the tribes. And so one of the principles here that is kind of subtly something we can pick up is like ministers, people who work for the Lord should be able to live close to that community that they serve. And that's one of the challenges in cities is, even back then, cities are expensive places to live. And so being able to stay in the city is hard for people who are working in as priests in the people in the time of Israel, but then even as pastors today, like working in a city is really difficult. And you can see that with the number of churches that are in large cities, even like Seattle, that those numbers of churches are going down, partly because pastors can't afford to live in the city anymore. And so we have to be, well, this is one of the ways that the Lord is ensuring for the people of Israel that his representatives are available in towns, in cities, all throughout the region, is that the Levites, unlike everybody else, can always redeem a house in the city. Verse 35. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So the people of Israel are not allowed to charge interest to one another. They are allowed to charge interest to foreigners later on, we'll see, people from outside, but even then they're to act justly and to not overcharge or to take advantage of the vulnerable. But especially for the people of Israel, like, they should watch out for one another, and help ensure that they are not falling into systemic rhythms of poverty. And so, like, when we think about the governing structure of Israel compared to our own time, like, we have a social safety net, and some people hate that idea, some people love that idea. But it is here in the people of Israel, it is present. Like, you should watch out for your neighbor and care for them, and make sure that they don't fall into poverty. But if it is unavoidable, even if they do fall into poverty, then they might sell the land. And if they sell the land and are able to redeem it, restore it at the Jubilee, always restore it. But even still, the debt might continue to accrue through all kinds of different reasons. At this point, it should be really hard for somebody in Israel to fall into this place, because they're supposed to be redeeming the land and returning the land every Jubilee. All these different things come back into generational holdings. But verse 39, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So Israelites should not become permanent slaves is the first part. And so care treat them as hired workers. They're paying off a debt. They're indentured servants. And every year of Jubilee, return them. So set them free. Outside of the people of Israel, outside of the covenant community, if somebody falls into this kind of poverty and they are coming to an Israelite for support, for help paying off their debts, security, then they can come to the Israelite, and the Israelite can buy their services as slaves. And so yeah, so that this is not a desire to have slaves. It is one more time where there is a indication that the Lord is trying to be compassionate and provide some security for people in poverty. This is the larger context of what's happening in here. And so it's not just like the Lord is commanding the people to go get slaves. He's not doing that, but he's saying if they find themselves in a place where they are desperate and in need, they can become slaves for the people of Israel. And I don't know how many people would have really wanted to do this, but there's evidence in the Old Testament of people having servants and slaves, but it should be motivated out of an act of compassion for the poor and the vulnerable, to provide for them, to help them get back on their feet, ultimately, in most cases. So, but one of the keys here is not that there are intended to treat these folks as like less than human or unworthy of care. It is really about the care for the poor and the vulnerable, and for people who are in great need. And yeah, so they had safeguards around their humanity, and making sure that there was no kind of abuse is a part of the slavery codes in the Old Testament. There are some examples of people who do choose to become permanent slaves. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 15 and Exodus 21. We talked a little bit about that in Exodus. And that is, again, partly to create some stability, and shelter, security, food, all of those things are made possible through these kinds of laws in the Old Testament. Verse 47, if a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner, to a member of the foreign clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them, an uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them. Or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves. They and their buyer are to count the time from the year they sold themselves up to the year of Jubilee. The price for their release is to be based on the rate paid to a hired worker for the number of years. If many years remain, they must pay for their redemption at a larger share of the price paid for them. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they are to compute that and pay for the redemption accordingly. They are to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. Even if someone is not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee, for the Israelites belong to me as the servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And so here we see like foreign people who are living among the people of Israel who get wealthy. An Israelite can choose to go to that person and say, will you take me on as a slave in your household? And that person can do that, but they have to, even a foreigner must follow the rules of the Jubilee for Israelites. And so that was like somehow they would make sure that was being observed and not ignored. But again, this is one more way the Lord is creating protections for people to be to be released. And so the year of Jubilee has an economic change in the way people think through like wealth and generational wealth in particular, and opportunity and equity. People are constantly it's constantly coming back to restoration, not to one person getting so far ahead of everybody else. The another aspect of this is socially. There's an emphasis throughout these rules and commands about um, the family stepping in first, and making sure that your kinsman redeemer is given an opportunity to redeem you out of poverty, so that you don't lose the land, so that you don't fall into greater debt with others, but to come into a place where you are um, able to be restored more quickly. But then the Jubilee is that hard reset, where everything is returned to the Lord's design for the people. And then theologically, the base of all these commands was that the land and the Israelites belong to God. And so every 7 years, they had a reminder that the land is God's. And every 50 years, they had a reminder that the land is God and they are God's. They belong to God, not they are. Anyway, they belong to God. And so they are constantly supposed to be going through these cycles of rest and restoration. But sadly, we don't see this happening consistently throughout the history of the people of Israel. And so um, these are great rules, great ideas, but hard to carry out. And the people of Israel show us how hard it is to carry these things out because they didn't do it. But the Lord is wrapping up this section of the law in Leviticus, and He's going to remind them of the blessings for following these commands and the curses for ignoring these commands, neglecting them. And so that's what chapter 26 is focused on. So let's start in verse 1 here. Do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. Observe my Sabbath and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grapes harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove wild beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall by the sword before you. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall by the sword before you. I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. You will still be eating last year's harvest when you will have to move it out to make room for the new. I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with heads held high. And so the first two verses are about rightly worshiping the Lord. Don't make any kind of idols and observe the Sabbath. So you've got the weekly rest, you've got the 7 year rest cycle, and the years of Jubilee rest all kind of locked in here. And then all these promises, the first verses 4 through 5, talking about abundant crops and how the Lord is promising to give them so much that they have to eat, they have to move it out of the way for the next year's crops. Like that's a lot of crops. We also see safety and peace in the land in verses 6 through 8. And in fact, their small number of warriors will be able to drive away greater, like tens of thousands of numbers, because the Lord is fighting on their behalf. And so like these are part of the promises from the Lord. And then also fruitfulness of womb and the crops. They'll have plenty of crops for the year. They will have children. They will have all these great things. And ultimately it's about the Lord's presence in their midst. He's choosing to dwell with them. And all of this book has been looking at God's promise to dwell with them. And as holy people, how do they maintain that holiness, that purity for themselves so that they can host the presence of the Lord? Now, that's really what the book of Leviticus is all about, following the Sabbath, following the holy days and the festival cycle, practicing Jubilee, observing the food clauses, the morality clauses. All of these different things are about purity so that the people of Israel can host the presence of God. And then, so these blessings are great and wonderful, but there is greater emphasis in the text on the curses. But the goal with this is not that God is like, these are some great ideas I really want to try out. The goal is to say, it is not worth it to disobey. So trust me and let's walk in the path of blessing. Don't ignore these laws and fall into the path of cursing. And so that's what is really getting at here in starting in verse 14. But if you will not listen to me and carry out all these commands, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out all my commands and so violate my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will bring on you sudden terror, wasting disease, and fever that will destroy your sight and sap your strength. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one is pursuing you. If after all this you will not listen to me, I will punish you for your sins 7 times over. I will break down your stubborn pride and make the sky above you like iron and the ground beneath you like bronze. Your strength will be spent in vain because your soil will not yield crops, nor will the trees of your land yield their fruit. If you remain hostile toward me and refuse to listen to me, I will multiply your afflictions seven times over, and as your sins deserve. I will send wild animals against you, and they will rob you of your children, destroy your cattle, and make you so few in number that your roads will be deserted. So the Lord is calling the people to faithfulness, and unfaithfulness leads to destruction. And so we see like the fear of their neighbors and enemies that will rise up against them. We also see the land will be hard to work. The iron sky and the bronze ground, essentially making it like impenetrable. So nothing's coming down from the sky for rain, and nothing's coming out of the ground because it's just a hard surface. It's hard as bronze, and the gates of heaven are closed. So these are also then wild animals will come and torment the people because they are also more faithful to God's design than the Lord is, than the people of Israel are, and so He is like will send them to get their attention as well. Verse 23. If in spite of these things you do not accept my correction, but continue to be hostile toward me, I myself will be hostile toward you and will afflict you for your sins 7 times over. And I will bring the sword on you and avenge the breaking of the covenant. When you withdraw into your cities, I will send a plague among you, and you will be given into enemy hands. When I cut off your supply of bread, 10 women will be able to bake your bread with one oven, and they will dole out the bread by weight. You will eat, but you will not be satisfied. If in spite of this, you still do not listen to me, but continue to be hostile toward me, then in my anger I will be hostile toward you, and I myself will punish you for your sins 7 times over. You will eat the flesh of your sons and flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your high places, cut down your incense altars, and pile your dead bodies on the lifeless forms of your idols, and I will abhor you. I will turn your cities into ruins and lay waste to your sanctuaries, and I will take no delight in the pleasing aroma of your offerings. I myself will lay waste the land, so that your enemies who live there will be appalled. I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste, and your cities will lie in ruins. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years all the time that lies desolate, and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbath. And all the time that it lies desolate, the land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths you lived in it. As for those of you who are left, I will make their hearts so fearful in the lands of their enemies, and the sound of wind-blown leaf will put them to flight. They will run as though fleeing from the sword and will fall even though no one is pursuing them. They will stumble over one another as though fleeing from a sword, even though no one is pursuing them. So you will not be able to stand before your enemies. You will perish among the nations. The land of your enemies will devour you. Those of you who are left will waste away in the lands of their enemies because of their sins also. because of their ancestors' sins, they will waste away. So this is intense stuff that the Lord is declaring that will come. And there's a key indicator of why these kinds of disciplinary actions will happen. First is idolatry. We see in 27 through um, 30, like the Lord is talking about tearing down their altars and their high places, their idols, because false worship, idolatry, is one of the key things that will lead to covenant unfaithfulness, that will lead to these kinds of curses. And so the Lord is saying, you've been praying for protection from these idols, but I'm going to tear these idols down and stack dead bodies by the idols to show how fruitless the idols truly are. But then we also see lack of taking the rest. The Sabbath rest is one of the reasons for the Lord's discipline of his people. And so the Lord is, as we're reading this, the Lord is telling the people what could happen, but also God is sovereign and he knows what would happen. And so when we read about the exile accounts later on, we can look at these passages and see like these things happened. People did get to the point where they were baking. 10 people were trying to bake bread in one oven. There were times where the cities were sieged and they resorted to cannibalism. Like this is part of the promise that God made to the people if they disobey, and the promise does come to pass. But God's desire is not for these things to happen, but he's also not going to sugarcoat the consequence of disobedience. He knows that that this is a real problem, and he wants them to be aware that he knows, and so that they can have the better chance of turning away from that kind of fruitless living. And ultimately, the goal, even here, is restoration, because we see this in verse 40. But if they will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, their unfaithfulness and their hostility toward me, which made me hostile toward them, so that I sent them into the land of their enemies, then, when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they pay for their sin, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land will be deserted by them and will enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. They will pay for their sins because they rejected my laws and abhorred my decrees. Yet, in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am the Lord their God. But for their sake, I will remember the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. I am the Lord. These are the decrees, the laws, and the regulations that the Lord established at Mount Sinai between himself and the Israelites through Moses. So the Lord is promising that if they repent, he will restore them. And it won't be fast, but there was a time where they will be restored after they have redeemed themselves for their sins and for their spiritual bankruptcy. And so when we look at the exile of 70 years, this is the time of the Sabbaths that the land will ultimately need to take. The Lord knows this. And so that time away was a time of redemption and rest, and ultimately a goal with the goal of restoration. And when we read these kinds of passages, one of the things that comes to mind for me is just remembering that sin is sin is deadly, and it's just really not worth it. But the Lord, um, in sending Jesus, as the ultimate sacrifice, as the ultimate act of redemption for people who put their faith in Jesus. Like we are not in the same kind of covenant stipulations where the Lord will come and take your land from you because you're not resting properly. Instead, we enter into rest knowing that Jesus has completed the work of redemption. And the Sabbath then becomes for us what God intended it to be, not a fearful day of not doing work, but a day where we can truly rest, knowing that the work is completed. The greatest work of all is done. And so we can truly rest. And so as we remember like confession in our own tradition now as followers of Jesus, confession is about restoration. And we might not lose land or anything like that, but it's about restoration to right relationship with God. And that's what God is trying to do here. He is trying to show them that even after a season of discipline and correction, there's a path to restoration that He desires for His people. But it starts with confession. And we see in the book of Judges, the people go through this cycle of disobedience, oppression, cry out to God. He sends a rescuer. They renew community and covenant with the Lord. Disobedience, oppression, call out to God, rescuer. This judges cycle happens over and over and over again. And Jesus, when we look to Jesus, we see that He is our final judge. He is our final rescuer. And so we have that comfort in Him. Let's look at the last chapter, chapter 27, which is about redeeming what is the Lord's. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value, set the value of a male between the ages of 20 and 60 at 50 shekels of silver, according to the sanctuary shekel. For a female, set her value at 30 shekels. For a person between the ages of 5 and 20, set the value of a male at 20 shekels and female at 10 shekels. For a person between 1 month and 5 years, set the value of a male at 5 shekels of silver and that of a female at 3 shekels of silver. For a person 60 years old or more, set the value of a male at 15 shekels and of a female at 10 shekels. If anyone making the vow is too poor to pay the specified amount, the person being dedicated is to present to the priest, who will set the value according to what that one making the vow can afford. If what they vowed is an animal that is acceptable as an offering to the Lord, such an animal given to the Lord becomes holy. They must not exchange it or substitute a good one for a bad one, or a bad one for a good one. If they should substitute one animal for another, both it and the substitute become holy. If what they vowed is a ceremonially unclean animal, one that is not acceptable as an offering to the Lord, the animal must be presented to the priest, who will judge its quality as good or bad. Whatever the value of the priest then sets, that is what it will be. If the owner wishes to redeem the animal, a fifth must be added to its value. All right. So vows and they're voluntary agreements that an individual would enter into. And so we see this, we'll see this in Numbers explained a little bit more, but the vow of the Nazarite is a voluntary commitment for a person to say, I want to fully honor the Lord with my life. And so they might set like a period of 6 years to say, I want to be dedicated to the work of the tabernacle. While they're not a Levite, they want to be involved and serve in this way. And so they can enter into this kind of agreement. Now, if they come to a place where they're like, I have to leave early, I can't fulfill this vow, this is where the redemption would come into play. And so they would look to say, like, okay, how many years was I able to fulfill this vow? How many years are left? And then they would work out this price of their redemption. And so for a person, like for the 20 to 60-year-old male, that's the highest value because of the work that a 20 to 6-year-old male was expected to be able to do during that time. And then the lowest value was a 1 month to 5-year-old female. And that is saying like you would dedicate a child to the service of the tabernacle as a way of honoring God for the gift of the child. And so like Samuel, is his mom Hannah dedicates Samuel to the Lord for life and says like, this is if you give me a son, I will give him to you. And so Samuel is a kind of Nazarite. And so this is one of the ways that the people would be able to um, you know work out these kinds of vows and agreements, and if they aren't able to finish it, how they could repay the Lord for not being able to complete their vow. And then also even the poor have an opportunity to do this as a dedication to the Lord, and the priest will set the value. Looking at animals, the same kind of thing. It would say like this animal I want to honor to the Lord. and it could be used as a payment for the vow. Even if so, like they say the person doesn't have the shekels, but they have flocks, they could also say like, we would like to bring these animals to pay the vow off, essentially. Um, so let's go to verse 14. If anyone dedicates their house or something holy to the Lord, the priest will judge its quality as good or bad. Whatever value the priest then sets, so it will remain. If the one who dedicates their house wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth of its value, and the house will again become theirs. If anyone dedicates to the Lord part of their family land, its value is to be set according to the value of the seed required for it, 50 shekels of silver to a homer of barley seed. If they dedicate a field during the year of Jubilee, the value that's set remains. But if they dedicate a field after the Jubilee, the priest will determine the value according to the number of years that remains until the year of Jubilee, and his set value will be reduced. If the one who dedicates the field wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth of its value, and the field will again become theirs. If, however, they do not redeem the field, or if they have sold it to someone else, it can never be redeemed. When the field is released in the Jubilee, it will become holy, like a field devoted to the Lord. It will become priestly property. If anyone dedicates to the Lord a field they have bought, which is not part of their family land, the priest will determine its value up to the year of Jubilee, and the owner must pay its value on that day as something holy to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, will revert to the person from whom it was bought, the one whose land it was. Every value is to be set according to the sanctuary shekel, 20 gerahs to a shekel. And so the practice of dedicating a house or land might involve a vow to make special provision beyond normal sacrifices or tithes for God's sanctuary or for the priesthood. And it may result from the lack of an heir. Say, like there isn't a son who can take this house. And so they could dedicate the house to the priests, to the tabernacle. They could rent the house, and those proceeds would go to the work of the tabernacle. And then it would also factor back into the year of Jubilee, going back into the family as possible. Same with the land. They could say, like, this section of my land, I'm going to dedicate whatever is produced from this to the temple. It's above the tithes, it's above the regular offerings and all the sacrifices. But say, whatever's happening here on this land, I'm giving to the Lord. And if the person wanted to buy it back, they would have to add a fifth of the value of the remaining years before Jubilee. And so the redemption of there's a redemption timeline too. Like if they buy a land, or if they sell a land and they don't redeem it before the year of Jubilee, then that is not redeemable land, and it becomes the priest's land. And so like there's these kind of rules about land. And keep in mind, the people of Israel at this point have no land. They have no concept of land. They've been slaves for hundreds of years. And so this is the Lord giving them the ground rules before they even get into the land, to say, like, you need to be thinking about this. And I want you to know how to ensure that you can honor God with what you have, but also be restored so your family doesn't fall into systemic poverty for generations and generations. Verse 26. No one, however, may dedicate the firstborn of an animal, since the firstborn already belongs to the Lord. Whether ox or sheep, it is the Lord's. If it is one of the unclean animals, it may be bought back at its set value, adding a fifth of the value to it. If it is not redeemed, it is to be sold at the set value. But nothing that a person owns and devotes to the Lord, whether a human being or animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted is most holy to the Lord. No person devoted to destruction may be ransomed. They are to be put to death. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. Whoever would redeem any of their uh, animal, any of their tithe, that must pass the fifth of the value to it. Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod, will be holy to the Lord. No one may pick out the good from the bad or make any substitution. If anyone does make a substitution, both the animal and its substitute become holy and cannot be redeemed. These are the commands the Lord gave Moses at Mount Sinai for the Israelites. And so here's another reminder to the people, like, don't just say, I'm going to dedicate this firstborn to the Lord of my flocks, because God's already put a claim on that. And so if you're going to make a special dedication, it has to be more than the firstborn. And then looking through the tithe of the flock, the specific commands, like the Lord's saying, like, don't just set aside the ones that you don't really want. And so like they would have the sheep come into the gate, right, as they're getting ready to prepare their tithe, and the shepherd would count them off: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That one's tithe. Whatever, if it's good, if it's a perfect spotless sheep, if it's the best looking sheep, or if it's the ugliest sheep, it was number 10, and they would take it and dedicate it as a tithe. And so they would go on down the line. This is one of the ways to make sure that people aren't trying to game the system, but trusting that the Lord is, that his tithe is happening in a reliable and unbiased way. And as we've seen, the tithe is intended to supply for the priests, the Levites, as they are scattered throughout the region. They don't have large tracts of land to work with. So when somebody dedicates some of the land to some of their land to the priests can work that land. The Levites can work that land during those years, so that they can generate the resources necessary for their families. And so this is one of the ways. So like when you look at the tabernacle system and the sacrifices, it's like there's a lot more Levites than could actually eat at the tabernacle. So what is the plan? This is the plan. They would have land that people could dedicate to the priests and the Levites so that they could provide for their families. But yeah, this last closing chapter of the book of Numbers is all about things that are dedicated to the Lord, and remembering that ultimately the people themselves are supposed to be completely devoted to the Lord. They are set apart. They are his. The land is his. The people are his. The tithes and offerings are his. Anything they dedicate to him are his. And he's reminding them of all these things and how they are to handle those things that belong to him, whether it is a dedication that they have, a special vow that they're making, or their regular tithes and offerings. They honoring these promises, honoring these commitments, is something that the Lord demands of the people of Israel, because he is the Lord their God who redeemed them from slavery in Egypt. So, and that is the book of Leviticus, y'all. We did it. Questions, thoughts, anything from this book that stands out to you? This book or this evening's section?
I had a question about one of the phrases in the last chapter. No one, where are we? No one devoted to destruction may be ransomed. What are they talking about?
Good question. And I do have a large section here highlighted from a commentary. So there are some acts in for the people of Israel that cannot be expiated through sacrifice or redemptions. So some of those things are false worship, violating the ban. So like Achan was when we get to Joshua, like he stole an idol, that was banned activity. And so Achan's whole family is destined for destruction. So false worship, violating the ban, murder, willful violations of ritual purity. And so the codes around the priests and their cleanliness, sexual immorality, all of those things, that's all some of the things that they cannot be redeemed because they are dedicated to destruction. And so they have committed.
Basically they can't pay their way out of justice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. They have committed acts that violate God's holiness and contaminate the community. Therefore, their sentence must be carried out without exception. Only in this way can God's name be restored to its proper sanctity and the people be cleansed of their impurity. So that is those large capital offenses are people who are dedicated to destruction. So,
Got it.
yeah. So, I mean, not super fun times, but
Yeah.
these kinds of offenses for the Lord are very serious. And so, like, he, in giving the law, he said, like, if you do this, you will be cut off. And so the warning has been given. And so it's not like God is just being like willy-nilly, like, I don't like that anymore, get him out of here.
Right.
But yeah, so
Just the wording is kind of awkward because, a person dedicated to destruction sounds like it's someone who really likes to blow things up or,
right.
you know, so,
Yeah.
but the phrasing
No.
dedicated to destruction can't, in this context, means like sentence to execution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not for people who just love fireworks. So they
Yeah.
cannot be redeemed.
Yeah.
Which would be
Like,
brutal.
yeah. I mean, because dedicated to destruction, if you can also be, like, it brings up connotations of people who are like suicidal or like ritually depressed or, cutting themselves or that kind of stuff. So that's, I'm like, why can't those people be redeemed? But if that's not what we're talking about, then that makes more sense.
Yeah. Just for clarity, when you did mention cutting themselves, and the cutting themselves, there is an element of that if it is like a part of false worship,
Right.
so like, just like that is in mind. Like if this person is doing this as a way of honoring an idol, or praying to the dead, or any of these different kinds of things that are outside of the Lord's commands, like that is
Right.
a path that is dedicated to destruction.
Right. But,
So
cutting themselves in the modern context is usually a mental health issue,
right.
like self-destruction kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's not in mind here.
Okay.
So, right.
Okay.
But again, I want something else to keep in mind. Like the ancient Israelites did not have an idea of mental health,
Right.
right? Like they did not, um, like there is no concept of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or melancholy or depression. Like there's no like words for that,
Right.
but we see symptoms of it throughout the Old Testament. We see people who seem to have, like, even Elijah seems to have some kind of bipolar depressive uh, nature, and Saul seems to
Right.
have some kind of bipolar nature going on. So while they don't have words for it, like there are evidences that there are things going on in people that are very reminiscent of what's happening in people today. And
Right.
so, yeah, but that's a whole, that we'll get to those later.
Okay.
But yeah, but as far as like thinking about suicidal thoughts or self-harm, those kinds of things, that the Bible is surprisingly unclear about things like that, and we would
Yeah.
want it to be more clear. But it wasn't a question that the people of Israel were really asking. And
Right.
so even when somebody takes their own life, um, like we don't know, right? And that's one of the hardest things, as in counseling people when a loved one commits suicide. Like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
the Bible doesn't give me a 100% answer. Um, and so, like, yeah, you shouldn't take a life. And that's the closest I can get. Like, that life is very, very holy, and it's a
Right.
gift. But does that mean that person is not in heaven? And I can't answer that. you know
Yeah.
so
You would hope that there's a lot of factors that go into that, decision? Like, were they in their right mind? Like, and does that state of mind, like, I think about my grandmother who had dementia for the past, few years of her life. And I know she was saved, but in those last years, um, you know, how was she walking with Jesus? Like, how was her,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So when someone has those kind of struggles where they're not in their right mind and they do something impulsive or whatever, um, then how does that factor in? You know,
Yeah.
um, is it your conscience or is it just your robot brain that yeah. So there's yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, ultimately, for followers of Jesus, our hope is in the salvation that Jesus makes
Right.
available.
Right.
And so, um, what I tell people is I can't answer the question of whether or not your loved one who committed suicide was is in heaven. The question we have to ask is, were they following Jesus?
Right.
Was their life committed to Jesus? That is the only comfort we have in those situations, and so like your grandma who was struggling with dementia, you know she wasn't sometimes that's the hardest thing, to watch a loved one go through that deterioration,
Yeah.
and start acting in ways that are just so foreign to how we've known them.
Right.
And so to remember, like, grandma's not a jerk. Like, she's
Right.
being really mean right now, but she's not a jerk. Like, she's not, this isn't her.
Right.
Right. Um, but yeah, it's hard to walk that road with folks too. Like,
Yeah.
oh man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Growing old and watching things happen, and like with walking with your family members through the aging process. This is one of the reasons why the Lord says, honor your father and mother,
Right.
so that it will go well with you and you may enjoy long life in the land. Because what I have learned is the way that I honor my mother and father, and as they get older, and like help them do things for them, like all that kind of stuff, my kids are watching me do that. And
Right.
I'm setting a standard to say, like, look, this is how we as a family treats each other. And so then when I have long life in the land, I have the support network from my kids and their kids, and then their kids, they support them, and on down the line. It's not just like honor your father and mother so you're loaded.
Right.
It's like, no, this is how you live in harmony with each other, even when it's hard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, none of that was in this text though.
No.
But yeah, any other questions or thoughts on Leviticus? Any questions on skin diseases or anything that we've gone over in the last several weeks?
No, I thought it was it's interesting how um how God has kind of laid out this plan. Like you said, they hadn't been in the land yet, so they have no concept of what it's going to be like to actually live in a house and that is their own, or own land and farm for themselves. And so kind of setting out the ground rules ahead of time, like this is what we're going to do, guys. Um and just remembering at the heart of it that God's plan is for restoration. And so the all of the laws are again about love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
Right.
So if we rightly love the Lord and we rightly love our neighbor, like, things will go better.
Right.
Yeah. So, and the love your neighbor as yourself is in the book of Leviticus.
Right.
And so when people like, say the greatest laws, like people say, love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you ask them, like, what was Jesus referring to there? He's like, most people would not be able to say, like, oh, Leviticus 19, right? But it's in there, and it's in a whole context of
Right.
what that actually looks like, and
Yeah.
not just be nice to people.
Yeah.
So much more than just be nice to people. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, you guys, next week we're starting Numbers, and yeah, there is going to be a census. So there are numbers, and I might, with your understanding, might jump over some numbers, just because some of the numbers are pretty boring.
Redundant.
So, but they're all there. They all matter. But for the sake of our purpose, like, we might not need to know all the numbers right now. So, all right. So
seems like you're talking more math, Jay. It looks like you're going to teach us math again. We're going to be taking math class over again.
No, I don't do math publicly.
Understood there would be no math. So.
I got a Bible degree, so I wouldn't have to do math.
Right.
So. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll see you all later, and have a great week.
All right.
Blessings to you, friends.